Yeah, so I think that, like, first of all, what it should look like is that it has Indigenous input into its design, and it should also have like a governance structure of Indigenous peoples governing and owning the like having ownership over that data and how it's used and things like that. I think it's very context dependent what these changes might look like. So you might have to have a different focus or reorientation of the questions. So with the PHQ-9, as I mentioned, it wasn't necessarily that they took out questions about self-harm or anything like that, but it was just about splitting those questions to get a bit more information about what's going on there. In some cases, it may be about translating the questions into a different language. So for some, particularly for older generations, they may be able to better understand psychological concepts and behaviors and stuff better in their own like language rather than English. Also, Indigenous peoples have typically traditionally been visual rather than visual and oral learners rather than sort of written text. So it might be that you use art and things like that rather than text to convey like instructions and things like that. But yeah, it would vary. It's quite a broad question, so it would vary very much depending on the context in which you were doing the assessment and who you were using it on and things like that.
Yeah, and another thought in this context is, of course, like just because, as we've talked about the regional diversity, so just because a test has been developed for one group like the Maori doesn't mean that it applies to one Aboriginal community, and if it's designed for the one Aboriginal community, it doesn't mean it applies to others. Those are really principles here.
So we are developing quite a little database for culturally developed and validated tools, which is amazing. There was a new one just released by Dr. Graham G the other day that's looking at PTSD and resilience, and it's only for Aboriginal people. So I think it's thinking critically about the test that you're using and why. I actually did a placement in a prison, and I questioned the test that they were doing there, and apparently no one else had for the 5 years that they'd been opened.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I actually don't know why we're not using a more validated tool. This is just the one we're told to, and that's concerning coming from practitioners, like really concerning. So like thinking critically about the evidence base that supports your decision, because you need to validate everything that you do as a clinician, as a researcher as well. Like, you know, that's just ethical at that point.
Yeah.
So there's a good evidence base out there these days around, or there's better ones than others around tests that have been validated within Aboriginal populations. So use them always first. And then if one doesn't exist and one doesn't exist and it's not similar, then consider why we really need it. What's the point?
Yeah, and validating it, like syncing to do that work. Like in the same way that if the tool isn't appropriate, let's say, and it was like a hacksaw instead of a scalpel, it's not like you're just like, oh, well, this is what we have, so we'll go ahead and use it. You kind of have to put up the red flag and be like, oh, wait, we don't have a good tool. We need to find a good tool before we move forward.
I think the development method would look very different. It's not about me picking it a trait or construct to measure and then trying to develop that and then going out and testing it. It's me listening to community and like, hey, it would be helpful if, you know, we had a specific measure for this phenomenon we keep experiencing but can't put a word to it, or like, you know, no one's believing me. So that would be when the test would be developed, if there's a purpose and a rationale and it's community developed in together. Also, we've been harping on about how important context is. So it would be developed for that community, and then we would look at nuanced ways to redevelop or change it or adapt it for other communities based on their cultural traditions and values and things like that, so that we can ensure that, you know, it's validated for each cultural mob as opposed to just Aboriginal people everywhere, because there is just so much diversity.
So much diversity, and even within communities between different generations. Like, for example, sometimes the grandparent generation is much more fluent in the heritage language, or men and women are having different intersectional experiences within the community, with the school system or with the police or whatever. So recognizing diversity is and tailoring to that diversity is part of what I see as well as important in practice. And I think, like, for me as well, where really resonated to what you said about developing the tool in partnership. A lot of the tradition of like Western kind of psychometric testing has been kind of for-profit and universalist. So you develop a tool like the intelligence test, and it's licensed, so it costs a lot, and that means that that's less accessible to some people. And the reality is it costs money to do science, so someone's going to need to pay to develop new tools, whether it's a taxpayer or whatever. But a model that is more sustainable for communities is when the tool is open to the public and open to practitioners rather than licensed. But I guess those are conversations that are different in different fields, right? I believe in clinical, almost all tests are still licensed as well.
Yeah.
In social psych, most tests are free. So the taxpayer pays for the development of the test through research grants, and then they're made available. Another aspect that we haven't been talking about for psychometric testing is the training of the practitioner. So in the kind of traditional methodology, it's like accredited psychologists, and the APS, the Australian Psychological Society, is accredited by the Australian state through the Psychology Board of Australia and other accreditation bodies. And so it's like everything's under the control of like traditional Australian education systems, and it doesn't come from community authorization and community practice and experiences. And that also is something that has a bearing on how the tools are used.
Absolutely. Thinking critically about the people or the organizations that are maintaining the system. It's important. Like, do they have a black fella on their board?
Yeah.
I'm not really sure. So,
yeah.
I remember Deloitte's did was it research? No, they did a visit to people in the Northern Territory on conflict resolution and negotiation. So the first day, they all sat down together and they didn't talk about the project or anything like that. They just got to know each other.
Right.
Yes, speak about each other, who they were, have they got children? So they were establishing a rapport and an empathy, and along the way setting up group rules, and so the trust came there and the engagement came there. So that's not just a tool for conflict resolution; it's a tool for how we show our empathy, our respect to people, but it comes back to us, because then they're more open to us and will freely then give us, because they feel a trust that you're going to handle them with care and respect them. And it's important.
And kind of circling back on that point for the benefit of students, like I can imagine a lot of students listening to this thinking, well, that's not really stats, that's not really research, that's something else, that's something very touchy-feely, but that's what really people need to think about. Is it's your choice to say that research is approaching someone as a product versus starting from a relationship. It's your choice to say research methods don't include listening to the community and getting to know them. It's your choice to say that research methods don't involve any kind of acknowledgement of country and culture and relationships and background. And not everyone shares the belief that that's research methods. So that's the kind of mind-blowing realization that some students are having right now. They're thinking, wait, I thought that surveys are research methods. Experiments are research methods. Yeah. And of course they are. But
Yeah, so what I was trying to do is put that, we can learn all the processes. We can do the literature, looking at how people have done things. But in real life, these are all the things that you need to take in consideration, because it's nothing worse than putting your heart and soul into something and it doesn't work, or it hasn't lifted off the ground. Is because you've missed that engagement, because you've haven't got the right questions. So you get these answers, but they're not really what you need to actually be a lever to get it. I mean, I like Yolanda Wadsworth's action research.
Okay.
That's one of my favourite stuff, is that when you're doing research, do it with people and action it, so you're having outcomes as you go along, people can see it's working, and if it's not working, then, adjusting it, fine-tuning it, because you're going on that journey together. The other thing I found that was important when I was doing work with mothers, teenage mothers at the Gold Coast, developed a 2-year program, rotational program for them. Was that I got an outside researcher to look at how I was doing that, and what the outcomes were. So she did independent research on what. So she later on followed up some of the girls to find out what the impact of that research was doing, and the group work was doing. And one of the things was decreased child abuse.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
wow.
a lot of
Congratulations.
the mums started doing further learning because they realised that they had confidence based on what I was, working with. A lot of that, and I would never have thought of that,
Right.
I was looking at the content on, parenting and looking after yourself and all this, and we had one lady come along there, a social worker, and she came dressed in like a hippie style clothes, and she was swearing, and she was, and because she had made the assumption that this is because these girls had been homeless, or they're only young and everything, that they were a certain type of person, and she was trying to mirror that. But you have to be true to yourself, because later on the girl said to me, we didn't like that. We come along to this group because we want to better ourselves, And I don't overdress, but I always dress to how I would like those girls to aspire to dress. And so when I'm doing things, so I'm meeting them at their level, and then I notice over time that they change their way of dressing. They mirror what I'm wearing, and how I talk, and they like that respect, and so the outside researcher is really lets you know how successful you are in what you're doing, and I don't know if other people do that, but it was something I needed to do, because it was a very important program, playing with these people's lives.